I was curious from the first moments, not as a pastime, but as a way to survive. From my earliest days, I was standing off on the side, watching, trying to understand a world that fascinated me. It was a world of coarse jokes and laughter late into the night, a world of gambling and drinking, and the frequent sight of the buttocks, thighs, and breasts of naked women. It seemed to me that the world was very interesting. How could you not want to explore a place like this? I was 3 years old. It was 1 a.m, and I was walking down the aisle of a smoky railroad car. I liked the feel of the train as it lurched and roared under my feet. My father was in burlesque, and he and my mother and I traveled from town to town with a company of comics, straight men, chorus girls, strippers, and talking women. As I moved down the aisle, not much taller than the armrests, I watched the card playing, the dice games, the drinking and joking late into the night. I would fall asleep on a makeshift bed made of 2 train seats jammed together. A few hours later, my mother would wake me as the train pulled into Buffalo or Pittsburgh or Philly. I'd sit up groggily and gaze out the window as she pulled on my woolen coat and rubbed my face, where the basket weave of the cane seat had left the pink lattice work on my cheek. As the train crept slowly into town, I could see the water towers, the factories, the freight trains jockeying across the rail yards in the gray early light. This would be the first sight I'd have of every city we traveled to, and my heart would beat with excitement. And then 5 or 6 times a day, at almost every show, I would be standing in the wings watching. There would be an opening number in which my father stood on the side of the stage and sang while chorus girls danced and showed their breasts. The person who performed this job in burlesque was called, with cheerful clarity, the tit singer. My father sang well, and he was a handsome man. When he walked down the street, people sometimes mistook him for Cary Grant and asked for his autograph. But when he was on stage as the tit singer, no one looked at him. After his song, my father would be the straight man for a comic, and then there would be a strip. The lights would go out, and over the loudspeaker a voice would announce, "The Casino Theater is proud to present Miss Fifi." In the pit, the drummer would beat out a rhythm while she kept time with her pelvis. She would slip off a piece of clothing and toss it into the wings. It would land a couple of feet from me, and a wardrobe mistress would pick it up and fold it carefully. The stripper would walk around the stage in time to the music and finally pull off the rest of her clothing. Except for some fringe where her underwear would go, she was naked. Blackout. The muscle in her hip would graze my shoulder as she brushed by me. She would grab a piece of her costume and hold it against her bare chest as she walked briskly up the stairs to her dressing room. Upstairs was where heaven was. The chorus girls always brought me up to their dressing room. They talked with me, they patted my cheek and combed my hair. They were affectionate. I was like a pet. When they had to change costumes, they would say, "Okay, Allie, turn your back now." While they changed, I stood with my face against the wall where their costumes were hanging. My face was buried in their silk clothes, and the smell of their sweat and perfume filled my nostrils. I heard the sound of their clothing sliding on and off their bodies. All of this was far more interesting for a 3-year-old than you might imagine. But I wasn't only the dancer's pet. I was a plaything for the whole company. When I was 6 months old, the comics thought it would be funny to bring me out in a high chair in a schoolroom sketch. When I was 2, the company was playing a theater in Toronto. A photographer from the Toronto Daily Star came backstage, and my father got the idea that if he posed me in a way that made me look as if I were smoking a pipe, the paper would be sure to print the picture and the burlesque company would get some unusual publicity. They dressed me up in my woolen suit and posed me gravely holding a pipe with tobacco in it. They seemed to have invented a new name for me, too. I was born Alfonso d'Abruzzo, but that day I was Alphonse Robert Alda, and Ali for short. The newspaper printed the picture and ran a story under it that 67 years later is a goldmine of information on how not to raise a child. Child of 2 smokes pipe, once broke mother's nose. Alphonse Robert Alda, at the age of 2 years and 3 months, finds solace from worldly cares in a briar pipe. I don't remember my mother ever telling me I had broken her nose, so this may have been invented to demonstrate how big and strong I was, or maybe to account for a slight bend in her nose that she wasn't fond of. As for smoking, according to the myth dreamed up by my father, I had reached up and taken the pipe out of his mouth a year earlier. My mother was quoted as saying they hoped I'd get sick and never smoke again, but that I liked it and had continued to smoke the pipe. Then they invented a specialist from New York whom they said they had consulted. He told us, my mother was quoted as saying, provided moderation was shown, the smoking might not do Allie as much harm as the psychological aspect of denying him. A couple of days later, everyone at the theater made a fuss over me and showed me my picture in the paper. I watched my father as he proudly held up the article and showed it around. I'd been told not to lie, and yet we all knew I didn't smoke. I drank a little beer with the comics, but I didn't smoke. Photographs from my childhood are snapshots of dress-up and make-believe. We were in show business, and reality was what you decided it was. There was my mother in the early pictures, a beautiful woman with brown hair. She had won a beauty contest when she was 20 or so and had toured for a year with a vaudeville troupe called Fanchon and Marco, in which the entire act seems to have consisted of young women walking across the stage in bathing suits. But then a couple of years later, the photographs begin to change. Her hair suddenly becomes blonde. A slight bump on her nose goes away, and the nose takes an upward turn. Around the same time, my father must have had surgery, too. His nose gets straighter, and he looks even more like Cary Grant. Each time I examined the past under a microscope, it seemed different, as if I were looking at it through a kaleidoscope. Even the pictures of the miserable summer when they left me with my mother's aunts in Wilmington, Delaware, are pictures of me dressed in a series of costumes. I'm not sure how I wound up in Wilmington. Maybe my parents thought the air was healthier in Delaware than in the alleys outside the burlesque theaters where I lingered with cops and their horses. But at the time, I suspected I was dumped in Wilmington because of a pig that my parents loved more than me. My father had written a sketch with his partner, Hank Henry, that involved a small pig. Midway through the sketch, Hank would say, "Get out of here and don't come back until you can bring home the bacon." My father would leave the stage, and at the end of the sketch he would come back with the pig under his arm and say, "Well, I brought home the bacon." Blackout. It's hard to imagine this getting a laugh from an audience, where they're playing town after town with this gag and making a living. But in order to be able to do that one blackout line, they lugged the pig from theater to theater. He rode in the back of their car. They fed him, gave him a place to sleep, and what I was most jealous of, they took him everywhere they went, without me. For a whole summer I was stashed in Wilmington with my mother's Aunt Betty and Aunt Ann, while Hank Henry and my parents drove around the burlesque wheel with the damned pig. I burned with anger and jealousy. On the way to Wilmington, my mother had been very cheerful, telling me what a great time I was going to have. Aunt Ann is a very fine woman, she said. A fine woman, a phrase soaked in phoniness. And Aunt Betty is so jolly. She's really, really funny. Aunt Betty was not jolly. She had a nervous laugh and a couple of large warts on her nose, and she tended to wear her stockings rolled down around her ankles. She smiled at everything. You fell down, she smiled. She was peculiar, which for my mother was jolly. Aunt Ann was skinny and stern. She had been a nurse among the Chinese before the war. I didn't know what this meant, but I didn't like the sound of it. My parents left me with these strange people, these civilians who were pretending to have something to do with our family. My parents would come by to visit me when they were playing near Wilmington, and they always brought a little suit of clothes for me, a uniform of some kind. They dressed me up in a sailor suit or a Royal Mounties outfit or a policeman's uniform, and then they took me into the yard with a box camera and took my picture, usually saluting. On their first visit, after they took the picture, they took me over to the back of the car and showed me the pig. I could tell they expected me to be excited because he was this fat little pink animal. I hated him. He got treated better than I did. For all I knew, he was the one going up to the chorus girls' dressing rooms now instead of me. My parents stayed for a couple of hours, then drove off with my little brother, the pig, and I was left with these crazy civilian sisters. When the summer was over, I went back on the road with them, but it wasn't long before they had to store me away again. When it was time for first grade, my parents realized they couldn't keep lugging me from town to town, so they signed me up at a Catholic boarding school in Manhattan. I remember the place in tones of black and white. Gray walls around an exercise yard full of screaming boys. In autumn, cold hands smudged with city grime, holding a weekly treat of a cheap ice cream bar. licking rivulets of